Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. I'm Liz Goodrich, part of the Community Relations team. And we are here today to discuss an important topic, and that is the 19th Amendment at 100 years. I've invited two of my favorite historians to join us to talk about that 19th Amendment and the ongoing struggle for voter equality. I'd first like to introduce Kelly Cannon-Miller. She is the Executive Director for the Deschutes County Historical Society, which operates the Deschutes Historical Museum in downtown Bend. She's a graduate of Portland State University with an MA in history, and she currently serves on the editorial board of the Oregon Encyclopedia and is a member of the Deschutes Cultural Coalition and writes for both the Oregon Encyclopedia and the Oregon Historical Quarterly. I'd also like to introduce Kimberly Jensen. She's a professor of history and gender studies at Western Oregon University in Monmouth, Oregon. She is the author of Mobilizing Minerva, American Women in the First World War, and Oregon's Doctor to the World, Esther, Pohl, Lovejoy, and a Life in Activism. She's a board member of the Oregon Women's History Consortium. So please welcome. And Kimberly, let's turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I'm just honored to be here and honored to share this program with both of you. So thanks. Let's get started with just a few background slides. I'm going to try to come full circle in this presentation. There's going to be another map at the end. And I'd like for you to think about what maps might mean to us as we think about history and as we look at social movements, because I think we are attuned in many ways to understand things in terms of maps. And this one is bounded by a national boundary, but we note that the acquisition of votes for women was complicated. It was patchwork. It involved, in some states, partial suffrage, like voting in local school elections. And in some states, most notably in the South, there was no suffrage at the state level or local level before the 19th Amendment was ratified on August 26, 1920. I want to stress that my view, and the view that I hope I can convince you to take, is that 1920 was a part of a long process, a process that we are engaged in at this very moment to secure and expand voting rights, to make the promise of our democracy real, that everyone who is a citizen eligible can vote. So I'd like to tell a story that is an Oregon story, but also a national story. And you'll see here that in the context of the national story, the West ruled. The West was a place where most states before 1920 had active campaigns. Most women in those states had achieved the right to vote. But Oregon, as you'll see, was one of the last, and certainly last on the West Coast, and we'll come back to talk a little more about that. Let's talk first of all about the foundation document of the state, the Oregon Constitution. The Constitutional Convention took place in 1857, and the Constitution went into effect in 1859. First, we see a fundamental contradiction in the section on suffrage and elections. We see that the organizers of the convention and the delegates said that all elections should be free and equal, but then they began to qualify that. In section 2, the limitations were a white male citizen, so gender and race and ethnicity were embedded there. And you can see the actual constitution and then the typewritten one, thanks to the Oregon Historical Society. And then in that same article on elections, even though race and ethnicity had been embedded with the word white and gender with male, Section 6 wanted to be even more specific. The delegates wanted to be more specific there. So they used Blackness, they used Chinese nationality, and they used mixed race status. The terms they used were no Negro, no Chinaman, or mulatto, mixed race person, could vote, should have the right of suffrage. So we see right away this fundamental contradiction in the founding document of Oregon. It's also the case that the Oregon Constitution was based on Black exclusion. There were debates about whether there should be slavery in the state, and slavery was not adopted, but essentially Black exclusion was adopted. And if you go to the Oregon Secretary of State's office, you can see how various delegates voted, and many of the delegates were from the South. So in this concept of what was known at the time as free soil, they were in favor of excluding Blacks from Oregon. I make this point because there were tremendous barriers for everyone who was a person of color, and women of color faced a double burden in terms of accessing one of the fundamental rights of citizenship, the right to vote. Now, the 15th Amendment was had technically overturned the provision about race or color. And this was ratified, of course, after the Civil War was fought around the question of slavery. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th said that if you were born or naturalized in the United States, you're a citizen. And then the 15th Amendment said it's not possible for the right of citizens to be challenged because of race, color, or condition of servitude. So this 15th Amendment technically overturned Oregon's white requirement for voting. But I think it's very significant that it was not until 1959 that Oregon ratified the 15th Amendment. And there were many Black activists in Portland and their allies who worked on that for almost a century. I also want to point out that there were other limits to voting embedded in the Constitution. The constitutional language is language that we find offensive, but it is referring to individuals who have a legal designation as being someone who we would say today would be developmentally disabled, or someone who was mentally challenged, someone who was in the Oregon State Hospital or other institutions, or someone who was imprisoned and was residing in the penitentiary. So this is a very important thing as well, because Oregon, as well as other states in the nation, will continue to work on this question. Is this really about democracy? And Oregon said no in 1944 to those who were felons and who had been imprisoned in the penitentiary. And then in 1980 began to roll back the laws about individuals, for example, who were residents of the Oregon State Hospital. So I want us to think about the magnitude of the limits and the barriers to voting that were encoded in the Oregon Constitution. That's why I think it's very important that we know from the very beginning of the Votes for Women movement in Oregon, a woman of color was there. Mary L. Beatty was one of 4 women, including Abigail Scott Duniway, who voted in the 1872 presidential election based on that 14th Amendment, that they were born in the United States, they were citizens, they should be able to vote. Women across the country did this. And I think it's really important and significant. Their votes were not counted. The election judge put them underneath the ballot box. But it's really important for us to see that from the very beginning, we want to hold on to the fact that there was tremendous discrimination in Oregon society and culture, but also in the law, and that individuals like Mary L. Beatty and others fought that. We can't just tell the story of that tremendous discrimination and racism. We can't just tell the story of their activism. We have to understand them both. We have to have both hands, if you will, as we think this historically. Mary Beatty was also present at the organization of the first Oregon State Women's Suffrage Association in 1873. I'm not going to go through all of this history, although I would be delighted to at another occasion. But Oregon has the distinction, it's a rather dubious one, of bringing the question of votes for women to the polls and to the male voters 6 times. This is more than any other state. And what you'll see is that this was not a steady progression upward, and that the 52%, which was the successful year of 1912, was a squeaker. It was not a large landslide. And we can see that the population of Oregon was really increasing, but that also in terms of demographics, that men were in a strong majority in those census years of 1900 and 1910. What I would like to do for just a minute as well is to have you think about the implications of who lived in Oregon. And these demographics are really powerful. So when we see that there are Black activists, when we see that there are Chinese American activists, that they are engaged in a process where they are among a very, very small minority of Oregonians. I'd like to encourage us to think about why 1912. Was it just that it was the 6th time, or were there new strategies that activists were employing? And it's definitely, in my opinion, the result of 2 really important strategies. The first, grassroots organizing and coalition building. This shouldn't surprise us. We know that when people become engaged for reasons of their own in an important movement, and when that grassroots activism is recognized and they're empowered, there's almost, there's a power there, and it's a successful strategy. And when you build coalitions with others, that's a great combination. And so the 1912 story is a story of organizing within communities and neighborhoods and organizations, but also building coalitions across those. So for example, starting here on the top, Hattie Redmond was president of the Black Women's Suffrage Association that had just been formed a few months in to 1912. There was a Chinese American Equal Suffrage Association. You can see here with Dr. Chen and her daughters forming the core of that group. Josephine Hirsch, who broke with other members of the Portland Jewish Women's Council to form the another Portland Equal Suffrage League. She was very wealthy, and many anti-suffragists were also wealthy. Things were going pretty well for them. They didn't really want a lot of change, but she broke with them and brought a lot of influential Portlanders, especially, into the movement. You can see Pike Davis, who was the chair of the Men's League, Marie Equi, who was a suffragist, but who also was someone who loved other women and was open about that. And her experience and her activism was very important in the movement. Esther Lovejoy, also pictured here, was really influential with linking with the National and also organizing forums and shared talks and so forth to really bring members of these movements together. And in this newspaper article, you'll see the Stenographers Equal Suffrage League. So, that occupational group was represented. So this is really important. In Portland alone, there were some 23 suffrage organizations in 1912. And across the state, including fabulous Bend, and I know Kelly will talk a little more about the Drake House and this organization, that there were dozens and dozens of suffrage organizations. So we know that when an organization is formed, when local people are involved and they're speaking to members of their own communities and then connecting with others, that's a recipe for success. And that's a really important outcome of 1912. The second thing I'd like to emphasize is the use of mass media and popular culture, the social media of the time. And we know that that's a really powerful tool for elections, for political activism in our own day. And it's also a powerful tool for propaganda in our own day as well. Here are a couple of examples. When you went to the theater, this would be the advertisement that would come down on the screen Remember that I said in the beginning that Oregon was behind Washington, California, and Idaho. All those states had women's suffrage by 1912. So here's this great example of using this visual when people are going to see a film. This poor Oregon man is all alone, and this is a graphic way of representing that. What could be better that at a particular time when it's summer in Portland to link the suffrage cause to the Portland Rose Festival. So here's the lunch wagon. They passed out sandwiches and just engaged in street theater to really raise the issues, and buns to boost suffrage, one of my favorite headlines ever. And also to really use wit in this popular culture. Of course, this book contains all the reasons why women should not have the ballot, and it's a blank book. I'll say just a very quick thing about using the vote. Using the vote involved office holding, jury service, and many other things, but also women were very interested in voter registration and getting out the vote. The vote is a tool to achieve change in our communities. This is Lizzie Weeks, who organized Black women's voter registration. Black women, especially in Portland, were very active. Here's Amanda Garvin, who is voting, and we see her voting in November of 1916. We have folks' voter registration cards, but we can't always know if people voted, but certainly we have strong evidence that Black women were very active and participated in voting. Oregon was part of national suffrage movements. The more radical wing, the National Woman's Party, the renamed group that had been the Congressional Union, during World War I, picketed the White House in an attempt to really focus on getting a national amendment, a federal amendment to the Constitution. And a number of Oregon women were part of the picketers and also part of those arrested for picketing. Here are Betty Graham and Alice Graham. They went to Washington, D.C. specifically to picket. They were arrested. The charge was blocking traffic and sent to the workhouse, where they hunger struck with Alice Pohl in the fall of 1917. Other suffragists were involved in the more middle of the road, moderate National American Women's Suffrage Association, and kept those national ties as well. And Oregon was the 25th state to ratify that federal 19th Amendment in a special session in January of 1920. And so Oregon was certainly among those states that ratified and was a part of that. So I'm going to stop here, and we want to hear from Kelly about some Bend specific information. So let me pass that to you, Kelly.
Thanks. Let me see if I can get my screen going here. It is always wonderful to hear from Kim, and I enjoy so much the resources that you have uncovered from archives around the state. And then the question becomes for us, where do we fit in this larger picture? And where are Central Oregon's women on this issue? So voila, I give you Bend the Beautiful in 1910. And so the first thing I would say is to understand what Deschutes County was like when these issues were happening. And I like to think that the development of Central Oregon is part of what helped push the suffrage through on that sixth attempt in 1912. Because for the first couple of attempts, we didn't exist. We are very much a 20th century developed place. The city of Bend isn't incorporated as a city until 1905. We're very small frontier homestead ranches up until 1900. And that's when we start seeing the formation of cities around Central Oregon. And so the population of Bend in 1910 is 536 people. In Redmond, it's only 216 people. And we're still part of Crook County, actually. Prineville is the county seat at this point, not Bend, and Deschutes doesn't even exist yet, which I'll circle back around to at the end of my little portion here. So we're part of a larger Crook County. We're very, very tiny. We're very, very small, but all of that is going to change in 1911 when the railroad comes. And when the railroad comes, then all of the beautiful ponderosa pine forests, all of the timber rights that are held by Midwestern lumber companies, all of that can kick into gear, and the resource extraction economy descends on the area with great force and great speed. And between 1910 and 1920, during this time period when women in Oregon get the right to vote, is a huge population explosion. So 1910, Bend is 536 people. By 1920, it's 5,415. Redmond, still some growth, still a little small. We go from 216 people to 585 people in 1920. And the county, when it's created in 1916, is just over 5,000 people. By 1920, when the 19th Amendment is ratified, the entire county comes in at 9,622 people. So we're still really small, we're still really rural, but it's a pretty dynamic population change that also happens during this time period. Between 1912, after the railroad comes, and then the opening of the two large sawmills on the Deschutes River, labor explodes here, and a lot of immigrants move here from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, from the Basque regions. So it's a very dynamic period here. And a lot of the people who are coming here, in addition to those immigrant populations, are young 20-somethings who are fresh out of college. The school teachers, the attorneys, the people coming to start businesses, to get jobs in the newly created county in 1916, they are a much more progressive bunch of people than the original homesteaders to the area had been. And so here is that great Drake Lodge picture that Kim referenced. This is actually May 1912. And this, let's see, my cursor, where's my little mouse? There it is. So this lady right here, this is part of that grassroots organizing that Kim was talking about. This woman is Sarah Ergot. She was Ergot at the time. Sarah Bardfield Ergot was her married name. She was a Portland activist who had come to Central Oregon. She had come down because George Palmer Putnam, his wife, Dorothy Binney, had invited her to come down and speak. She gave 6, I think, different lectures over a 2-day time period when she was in Central Oregon, speaking on why women should have the vote. And obviously, George Palmer Putnam owning the Bend Bulletin and being the editor, his mother back in New York was a suffragette. His wife, Dorothy, was very involved. So it shouldn't really surprise us that the Bend Bulletin gave Sarah great coverage. You can see here, this column on the front page is all about Sarah's message. It's actually written by her, so they actually gave her space on the front page, and they gave her a glowing editorial in support that is hilarious in terms of, today looking back to think that, this is how people wrote and spoke about it, that it talks about of women suffrage speakers, there's a couple different kinds. The first are of militant mien, and they are fearsome, and they will cow a man, in his shoes. And others are just weepy and really can't hold it together. And all you want to do is hug them and take care of them. But then they say there's this third group, and that those are the women like Sarah. And they basically end their editorial by saying, if all suffragette speakers were as clear and concise as Mrs. Ergot, this would have been solved a long time ago. We would have passed suffrage. So Sarah comes to town and meets with just, it feels like overwhelming support. Everyone here is open and engaged in what she's talking about. And then the other side of that is that, George was going to run for mayor, and a lot of the husbands of the wives who were involved in the suffrage movement were running for city council positions. So it was also in their best interest to be supporting the women's movement. So hooray, suffrage is passed in November of 1912. And George is indeed elected mayor of Bend, and several of the other husbands are elected to council positions. And then the next question is, when does this take effect? Because Bend has an election coming up on December 3rd of 1912. So George writes to the state and gets word that he should consider suffrage in effect, as of the day of the election when it was passed. And so women can vote on December 3rd. And they may have indeed been the first women in the state to exercise their suffrage. And the question, posed throughout the Bend Bulletin was, will they show up? They finally have the vote. Will they show up? Yes, they showed up incredibly and in force. They lined up before dawn to make sure they were there when the polls opened. Unfortunately, this is the only picture I have of her, and it's just a newspaper reprint. So it's really grainy, and she looks rather like, the pictures of aliens that come down with the, and kidnap people. But this is Mrs. S.M. Whitted. She was of Redmond. She had moved here from North Carolina. She was 75 years old. She was first in line before dawn. And her son was quoted in the paper as saying, I had no idea she even cared, to have the right to vote. And yet there she was before dawn, wanting to be first in line. And all of the teachers were in line right behind her. And the paper proudly reported that they obviously had done their research, knew exactly how they wanted to vote and get it done before the school day started. So hooray, we're using our right to vote. And then, when I look at 1912 to 1920, what were our suffragettes doing? How are they helping get this passed at the national level? And when you first go into doing research and you're looking for a specific thing and you don't find it, you're a little disappointed. I'm like, where did they go? What are they up to? Did they get suffrage for themselves and figure the fight, for everybody else is on their own? And then you start looking around and you see that no, the women of Central Oregon, the women of Deschutes County are too busy using their suffrage to be going back east and fighting and doing that. They're too busy building this place. So this picture is the Bend Bridge Club. This is at the Lara's house. This is also taken in 1912. And many of these women are in that same photograph on the Drake Lodge porch. And I want to point out, where's my little arrow? There it is. This woman right here is Mary Coleman. She was single, and she was a member of the Bend Bridge Club, of the Women's Civic League. And Mary gets herself elected as Bend City Treasurer starting in 1914. And she's reelected every 2 years and serves in the post from 1914 to 1922. She was also active, considered a librarian and a part of the library committee, and helps get the library grow from being just the City of Bend Library to eventually the Deschutes Public Library, who we're pleased to be speaking for today. Here's an article that I love from the April 11th, 1918 bulletin. This is them giving their predictions on the spring voting primaries. And halfway down, you see women will shine. And they say, with a number of years of experience politically, the women of Oregon unquestionably will shine at the coming primaries. And any candidate who feels that he can slip along without their assistance is apt to find himself far behind in the running. So when I say that the women voters of Deschutes County were busy between 1912 and 1920, they absolutely were. There were bond measures every year. Sometimes there was more than one bond measure needed between building schools, doing infrastructure, all those kinds of pieces. kept the voters of Deschutes County very busy, and women were right there playing their part. This was another example of the power of the women's vote during these years. This is from November 3rd, 1920. It's an open letter published in the Bulletin by newly elected City Councilman C.J. Leverett, thanking the people who voted for him. And all the way down, second to the last paragraph, he says, I got a part of the labor vote, some of the businessmen's vote, but the women's vote and the independent vote put me in. Many thanks. He kind of hints at it got a little bit dirty maybe during that election, but he doesn't hold any grudges and would like to still be friends with everyone. But he definitely, took the time to write to the paper to say thank you to the women voters of Bend. He understood clearly that they helped put him in office. And this article also shows the level of their involvement. This is an article describing the upcoming work of the Bend Commercial Club and how they are actively courting the Women's Civic League of Bend and bringing them up to speed on what was happening with the commercial club. This is taking place in 1920. It references several other communities around the country and the engagement between commercial clubs like Bend's and women's civic leagues and how the two can come together to really get quality work done in their community. And how it's a welcome situation for all. And these are an example of two of the projects that the women of Bend were working on with their suffrage. One was getting Drake Park created, so the kind of jewel of our community along the Deschutes River where so many community events happen. We only have Drake Park because the Women's Civic League really pushed to make it happen, and that included using the ballot, knowing how to talk to City Council, get the park proposal on the ballot, and get it voted on and campaign to get it pushed through. And they also worked on projects like a day nursery for women who needed daycare, and they started out running it in the gymnasium, which at that point it's a small enough place that you could just say we're running a day nursery in the gymnasium and everybody knows what you're talking about. And then by 1920 they were able to buy a piece of property and actually build a building specifically to run a day nursery for women who needed childcare to go to work. So the big one though, the really big place where women's suffrage and every vote counts, where that came into play was with the creation of Deschutes County and splitting up of Cook County. So as the state, was homesteaded and laid out, a lot of different counties went through this process of shrinking and being broken down into smaller counties over time as populations grew and tax bases spread out. And Cook County was no different. And as early as 1900, when those very first, homesteaders and ranchers were out here setting up shop, the idea that Prineville was so far removed from them and couldn't they break off into smaller counties? And so originally the Tri-County area that we know today of Cook County with Prineville and Jefferson County with Madras and Deschutes County with Bend as the county seats, it was all Cook County. And in 1910, they start that early talking about how to split the county up. And, that takes a lot of agreement. Where do you draw the boundary lines? Who wants to be in what county? And it truly, a lot of it does boil down to tax base and tax dollars. In 1914, Jefferson County successfully splits off and is formed, leaving Cook County that we see in this map here. And this shows two different attempts at creating Deschutes County, the proposed line in 1914 versus the proposed line in 1916. So 1914 was not a successful attempt to try and create the county. And when it came in front of voters in 1916, it was required that you had 65% of the voters in the proposed Deschutes County side and 35% of the voters in what would still be Cook County saying yes in order to have a successful vote. So that was how they were splitting the vote and the percentage share. So if 65% of who would be Deschutes County said yes, and 35% of who was being left behind in Cook County said yes, you would get the new county of Deschutes. So the day comes, the election happens, and everything gets counted, and the tiny little precinct of Fife, this is going to end up in courts. So here we show county division matter is in the court to be decided. And here are the numbers. And little Fife, the Fife precinct right down here, 5 votes for creating Deschutes County, 35 votes against creating Deschutes County. Then the question was, is Fife going to be in Deschutes County, or is Fife going to be in Cook County, and whose votes get counted in which side? And so only 40 votes decided this matter. And in the end, that led to lots of gossip that, you know, Cook County was saying that, oh, there's 200 fraudulent votes, and they were fighting it in court. And in the end, Cook County couldn't produce documentation that there had been any voter fraud. There weren't 200 mystery votes. That the 65-35 law rule would stand, and Deschutes County was created. But it did all come down to just a handful of votes. So every vote does count, and that's where it absolutely mattered that the suffrage base of Deschutes County included women and included, you know, them in the process and staying engaged and staying involved. And how would it have been different if they hadn't had the vote at that point? And then lastly, I just wanted to share that even though, you know, Bend feels progressive in terms of, and Deschutes County at large in terms of, yeah, why not women's suffrage? Of course, we need women's suffrage, as you get this wave of a new generation moving here and wanting to support it and actively using their suffrage in passing bonds and passing county ordinances to create the county and build this place. But it's still 1920. This joke does show up in the Bend Bulletin, you know, about how can you stand your wife being gone all the time to all these suffrage things, and, you know, the ha-ha of the husband, well, you wouldn't if you tasted her cooking. So that's where Bend is at in this larger conversation of the whole state. And now I will try and pass it back to Kim.
Thanks very much for that really in-depth look at the ways that Bend activists were engaging with the vote. And I'm also just struck again by how important newspapers were in the social media of the time, and informing and gathering and so forth. And we're so glad that the University of Oregon, the Library of Congress, and others are digitizing newspapers. It's very important. I want to take just a few minutes to talk about some new barriers to voting and some continuing barriers to voting after 1920, because I'm going to urge us to think about that there's another journey, and it's a continuing journey that we're addressing today. I'll start by saying that Representative Sylvia Thompson was the 3rd woman in the Oregon legislature, and she was the one that co-sponsored Oregon's ratification of the 19th Amendment. We want to hold that in this hand. We also know that Thompson had been an elocutionist, I can't even say the word now, elocutionist, a public speaker, and that she often performed in blackface. So we need to understand the context of a movement that is full of contradictions. It is asking for equal suffrage, but is taking place in a context of systemic racism and cultural empowerment of white Oregonians. And so I really think this is an important issue for us to think about, and I'll just have a few examples here. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is widely considered to be the very, very important next step in voting protections and in expanding the promise of democracy to Americans, removing things like the poll tax and having federal rules about what local and state laws can be about voting, and to try to, address discrimination. But in Oregon, there were new and continuing barriers. Let me talk just for a moment about the 1924 Voter Literacy Amendment. This passed this was presented to the people, and it passed with 79% of the vote. This was after World War I, at a time of increasing concern about immigration, and it's a time of the Klan has been very active. Oregon is one of the most active states. And so this is an amendment that says that you need to be able to read and write the English language. Now, there was a federal requirement, but it could be in any language. And this is clearly parallel with a very stringent 1924 Immigration Act that's passed. And so in Oregon, the Secretary of State sent out these boxed sets with a paragraph from the Oregon Constitution. And if the election judge believed that you might not be able to read or write in the English language, you were supposed to read this and then provide some interpretation. So this was how the voter literacy test was carried out. And you'll see that it was technically overturned by the Federal Voting Rights Act of 65. These were precisely the kinds of tests that the Voting Rights Act was designed to end. But it was not really until Measure 10 made Oregon law in compliance with that 1965 Voting Rights Act in 1974, and also ratifying the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18. This in 1974 was even more of a squeaker than votes for women, just over 50% of the vote. So here's an example of pushing back voting rights in Oregon in 1924, lasting lasting for 50 years. It's also important to note that the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 opened some doors for women in the tribes to vote. Eleanor Houck, for example, who was the first Indigenous woman to attend the U of O, would likely have been a voter. She was later a teacher at Chemawa. But women who were residing on the reservation, who also perhaps did not have English language skills, would have not been able to participate, especially in Oregon, because of that literacy bill. First generation Asian Americans were prevented in federal law from becoming citizens and therefore voting. And so that was in effect until during and after World War II, finally with McCarran-Walter. And I want to point out that McCarran-Walter opened citizenship for immigrant first generation Asian Americans, but it tightened and restricted the immigration of anyone who was considered to be what the term was at the time, homosexual. And so again, these are uneven developments and progress for some, but restrictions on others. From immigration law in effect from 1907 to beginning to be addressed in 1922, the Expatriation Act of 1907 said that if you are a woman born in the US and you marry a man who is not a US citizen, you forfeit your US citizenship and take his citizenship. This resulted in about 400 Oregon women during World War I who had married men who were German citizens, who had to register as enemy aliens. Here's Hattie Darrens, who was in that situation. The Cable Act began to address this, but there were still many changes necessary to really eradicate this derivative, this citizenship derived from your husband's citizenship. And I think it's really important to see that even for individuals, there could be possible progress and possible backlash. I think Marie Equi is a really important example of that. And if you have not yet read Michael Hellquist's biography of Marie Equi, please do put that on your list. Equi was a suffragist. She was involved in the Oregon campaigns, especially of 1906 and 1912. But as a woman who loved other women and who was open about that, she was targeted, especially as she became more radical politically. When she opposed World War I, she was sentenced to San Quentin for violating the Espionage Act. But Hellquist and others have really helped us to see that there was a very powerful homophobia that was at work, and she faced physical abuse as well as powerful targeting. Margot Kennedy encourages us to think about that as laws about voting and as laws about race begin to be addressed in the 20th century, there are more and more restrictive laws for LGBTQ plus people. And so there's a backlash that we have to understand as well. So for someone like Marie Equi, she experienced both. I think it's really important as we think about this continuing story that we think about the many leaders in Oregon who have continued to challenge those barriers. Just two examples of many. Catherine Jones Harrison, who was so instrumental in the restoration of the Siletz and then the Grand Ronde tribes, and who served as the first woman who chaired Grand Ronde's tribal council and also on the council for dozens of years. Her accomplishments, both as making that restoration happen and helping to create that very important tribal sovereignty, but also her accomplishments as a leader. And Teresa Alonso Leon, who is Oregon's first immigrant Latina in the state legislature. So we have continuing stories of barrier breaking that I encourage us to really include in this story of women's activism and women's empowerment through the vote. I said I wanted to come full circle with a map. The Voting Rights Act has been challenged, and there have been laws passed that have taken away from the Voting Rights Act. This is a visual from the Brennan Center for Justice that traces the developments of voting restrictions passed since 2010. And of course, the decision of 2013 to remove the precautions and the need to check in with states who need what was called pre-clearance has been removed. We see voting restriction, and we see also that we can link this to areas of growth, especially in these maps for Latinx growth and African American residents. And so this is a very important map to include as we think about suffrage, because voting rights are very fragile. They are fragile, I think, because voting is very powerful, and that empowerment is something that is threatening to those who want to hold on to power. So I'd encourage you to think about this map at the same time that we think about the map of suffrage in 1920. Two things very briefly before we have our Q&A. I'd encourage you to visit the Oregon Women's History Consortium website. I've engaged with a number of students who have done research to create online exhibits about issues around 2020. I want to give a shout out to my colleague Jan Dilge, who is Oregon's representative on the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. And she's done incredible work in putting Oregon on the map, in having virtual mapping sessions. There are opportunities for all of you listening to get engaged with this. So I'd encourage you to go to the website for that. And also, I really want to encourage you to go to the Chalk the Vote segment of our website. From August 23rd to August 29th, we're going to have statewide Chalking the Vote. And this involves chalking the words of the amendment or many amendments. Through Jan's work, we have those in English and Spanish on the website and more languages coming soon. Get some chalk, find a place to chalk, and then send your what you have done via social media. The Oregon Historical Society is co-sponsoring this. And you can also send it to Oregon 2020's email, and those will all get posted and archived as some of the activism that we engaged in during 2020. And then just finally, get some great pins at Kelly's place, the Deschutes County Historical Museum. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kimberly and Kelly. That was such a great presentation. And as you were talking, I had a couple of questions, and then we can just kind of get into a discussion. So Kimberly, during your first section, you mentioned radical versus moderate suffragettes and those two different groups. Can you talk a little bit more about those? Give us some sort of context for what it meant to be radical versus moderate at that time.
So World War I, the United States entered World War I in April of 1917, and these were the kind of last stages of the movement for a federal amendment to the Constitution. As you saw in the map, lots of states had done that, but there's this push for a federal amendment. And Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and those who were part of the Congressional Union turned the name of their organization, which had really represented this idea that we're going to get a congressional amendment, to the National Woman's Party. And they insisted that the work of suffrage should not take a back seat to the First World War. And so they went to Washington, D.C. from all over the nation. Picketers came, and they engaged in picketing and protest, peaceful protest, often without their family's support. And they used Wilson's slogans that he had used to try to encourage the United States to become part of World War II, to make the world safe for democracy. So they quoted his speeches and said, how can you say that we're a democracy when many women can't vote, right? So they were engaged in peaceful protest, but they were taking that to the streets, if you will. And so it feels familiar to us because we're in that moment in our own day. They also were radical because they were willing to go to jail. The charge was obstruction of traffic. There were often bystanders who were yelling at them. Some engaged with them physically. Certainly they had a lot of physical abuse as they were arrested and put into the patrol wagons as they were sent to the workhouse. Betty Graham left an account of their hunger striking. So hunger striking was a strategy for peaceful protest, but it's saying, you may control my physical person in this jail, but you can't force me to eat, and I'm going to protest by doing that. And so that's a strategy that many have used, since then to protest, especially prison conditions and so forth. So they did not want to follow the idea that they would sort of put off their work. They engaged in the streets. And so for all of those reasons, they took a more radical stance. And one thing we might consider is that often it's the case that when there are radicals pushing from one particular side, or whose actions seem to be really challenging the way things are, that sometimes that creates a little more support for the amendment itself, and that certainly I think that happened. The moderates wanted to, work through reform, and so there were all sorts. Also, there were women who opposed suffrage. Many of them opposed the enfranchisement of women because they believed that women who were wage earners would vote more, and so there would be, challenges to their family department store business, so the lumber business, right? About that, there were lots of people who thought that just women's activity outside of the home was something radical. So there's a whole series of ways, I think, that especially the members of the National Women's Party were. How else can I answer your question there, Liz?
No, I think that's good, but that your response brings up just something I'd like to delve into just a little bit and sort of clear the air, in that the radical and the moderate movements of the suffragettes, and you talked a little bit about the activists of color that were working early on, and I'm just wondering what's the historical context of either wing of the suffragette movement when they started looking at including women of color in their efforts. And can you just sort of fill in a little context there?
I would say that both the Congressional Union and National Women's Party members and the National American Women's Suffrage members and various affiliates were mainly white women. And it was through the efforts of Black women who knocked on the doors of those organizations, and some, like Mary Church Terrell at the national level, Terrell was one of the officers and a frequent speaker. Some of those knocks, that persistence happened, but often Black women formed their own organizations because racism was rampant, because they weren't able to have true membership there. A lot of the mainstream organizations like the Federation of Women's Clubs, General Federation of Women's Clubs, excluded Black women from white women's clubs. There could be segregated clubs. And so in 1912 in Portland, we have evidence of a limited crossing of those boundaries. The Black Women's Suffrage Group signed on for like notes of thanks for the various city suffrage, the major ones. They were, Hattie Redmond and the Black Women's Suffrage Group would be included with that. They had forums. There were speakers across that, and so, I think that in this case there's a limited challenging of that, and Black women did that because they were another suffrage organization. They were organizing to encourage Black men to vote. And so there were ways in which they made themselves visible, and they had speakers, and they were part of that coalition. But it's really, this is an issue that is a really important issue in the women's movements of the 60s and 70s. And it's an issue about women of color. It's an issue about women who identify as lesbian. There are these barriers. And so I think it's really important for us to think about that. If we know this history, then we can be more mindful as we move forward in our own attempts to try to make our communities better, that this history teaches us that we need to step back and think about that to include everyone is our objective. And so how can we do that? But it did not happen because Alice Paul or Anna Shaw said, oh, wow, you know, and so I think that again, that tension, the racism that Black women and women of color experienced, and their insistence and persistence on taking action and making those claims and continuing that is really a key part of the story.
Yeah. Thank you. Kelly, I have a question for you about the CJ Leverett acceptance speech and thank you note in the
Thank you
bulletin.
letter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you letter. I was really struck by the you know, this particular calling out of the women's vote and the independent vote. And I'm wondering, because I think we see that happening now, like the women vote, the female vote, and then independent vote, those, have they always, have elections often, you know, since white women were given the right to vote, have those two groups been influential in elections?
Yeah, yes. And the thing that I didn't dive into because felt like I was rattling on is that, so that same time period where I was talking about the immigrants coming in, that wave of nationalism and alien status that swirls around World War I really bears down on Bend. And actually, white supremacist groups in the Valley were pointing fingers at Bend and labeling us as the third, I think we were labeled the second or third highest employers of alien labor in the entire state. And so both Brooks Scanlon and Shevlin Hickson really made company policy for naturalization. It became a very big deal in the company newsletters and in the Bend Bulletin to be reporting on who was achieving naturalization. And of course, what's the biggest benefit that you get by becoming an American is the power of that vote, which had great appeal. I mean, if you think about the countries where many of these immigrants were coming from, they were escaping World War I, many of them, and coming here. And so the appeal of suffrage as part of naturalization was very strong. What I haven't been able to really research is how, you know, so you have largely male employees in the mills being encouraged with naturalization and providing access to getting, you know, the education that they needed and access to taking the tests. How much did that spill over to their wives, you know, at home? And that I'm not clear on at this point in my research. And so there is this swirl of who's an alien, and it brings the question forward. If you think about where most of our immigrants were coming from, they're the ones that are allowed the melting pot. You know, a lot of us grew up with the idea of the melting pot and becoming American, but really who was allowed to melt in and become American and do that vote? And a lot of our immigrants get, you know, absorbed into a larger whiteness of the area. But the other group largely at play here for us politically is religious groupings. So Irish and Eastern European Catholics, our population is very heavily Catholic at this point. And so some political groups that are trying to make an inroads in the teens and early 20s, among them is the Ku Klux Klan, and they don't do very well in our part of the world because we're so heavily Catholic. So the answer to your question is yes.
And just to add a bit to that, Oregon was one of a number of states that allowed men with first papers to vote until 1914. So if you'd applied for naturalization, you haven't had the residency, you know, but you've applied, then you could vote. So there's this big question now after 1912, what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with that? Because there were a lot of non-citizen men who had been able to vote, but then their wives couldn't vote because their status until 1922 was dependent on what their husbands were doing. So then if you think about World War I and those complications, in 1922, with the Cable Act, it begins to mean that women can keep their own citizenship. But it also means that if a woman comes from Eastern Europe, she has to become naturalized herself now. So it's really interesting. And Kelly, it'd be really interesting to see if there were clubs and organizations that were, they called it Americanization, and that's a double-edged sword. It could be supportive and it could also be tremendously dismissive and divisive.
Right.
But in Portland, there are clubs that are saying we need to get ready because we need to make sure that women are knowing about that they need to go take the test and that they are getting the night classes that they need to be able to do that. So it's such an interesting time because all these changes are swirling.
It is. And there's a strong anti-German sentiment here. The newspaper, the day World War I that America enters, so Wilson, across the top, and we're in the war, and then over off to the side is this little tiny piece where two Bosches have been detained for suspicious behavior. So Bosches was a negative derogatory term for Germans. And, so you think about that tug and pull between the Eastern European Slavic community that was here and the German, population that was here, and which leads to one of my favorite things on the 1920 census, that someone here lists their country of origin as Berlin. Like not Germany. Nope, I'm from Berlin.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking at some of the other notes I took, and I just am struck by, the years between 1920 and 1965, and imagine being a person of color watching and not being able to fully exercise the franchise for that long of a period of time. And then I think about currently, and I'm also struck by the fact that, voter suppression is not new, or whether or not you want to call it voter suppression, but restricting the right to vote is not a new thing here. And I'm wondering if you can speak to the current erosion of protection of voters, and what do you each think about that, and what's the end game here, ladies? Big question.
I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll dive in.
You go.
I think we in Oregon are used to voting by mail. We find that to be a process that has been a successful one in many cases. And so as we think about some of the attempts to prevent people from voting, the layer of COVID now has created this question of is voting by mail safe, and can it be? And are there the resources necessary to make that happen? Will the post office deliver ballots and get them in on time? And what I've seen lately is a lot of grassroots activism and coalition building around the idea of making sure that people have different options for voting, and educating people about all of that, and providing support and resources for that. So it seems to me that we're witnessing some coalition building around the right to vote, or the access to vote. That's very important.
Way to dive in.
Yeah.
Good job.
So being attached to a historical society, I think the thing when I took this job that I wasn't prepared for, but yet has been a gift, are the number of my members whose personal stories I get to hear and catalog and capture so that other people can know about them. And one of them is Susie Penhollow, who for 20 some odd years was the county clerk for Deschutes County. She is a descendant of one of those Eastern European families. So her mother helped campaign. When I asked Susie about what did it mean to you to run for office and to campaign, and she laughed and she says, well, I hated campaigning, but my mother loved it. And so her mother was Millie Chop, and she had immigrated here from Eastern Europe, and would go around and be the one knocking on the doors and talking up her daughter and sharing that. And one of Susie's experiences as a county clerk was to go back to Serbia and serve as an election official and an observer to make sure that democracy was being allowed to happen. And to go from running a mail-in election in Oregon to Serbia, where you're being transported in a vehicle and you actually hear gunfire happening somewhere off in the distance, is a powerful reminder of what we have, this gift that we have that is, you know, ours to use, and you have to use it. And when you don't use it is when it's taken away from you. And there are people among us who have these stories to tell, who don't have the benefit of suffrage, or had to work so hard to have it. And I just would encourage people to find those conversations and remember the value of our suffrage.
One of the grassroots movements that's happening now is that folks are encouraging people to find 5 people that they know and check in with them to make sure that they're voting, that they have what they need, that you know, there's that. That's an example, I think, of you know, the kind of work that's you know, supporting what Kelly is saying about the importance of voting. I also think it's important to remember, when I was looking at the election of 1912 a long time ago for the book on Esther Lovejoy, there were some votes that came in by mule late, right, weeks. And so I think that, you know, that we need to understand that there's a, you know, there are ways that we can work to make sure that all of those are counted, and that's part of the history as well.
Yeah, and I think, Kimberly, my takeaway from today's presentation, and something I'm going to hold with me as I check in with 5 people about their registration status, is that voting rights are fragile, and it's nothing to be, the right to vote, the right to exercise your franchise and be heard, is such a powerful thing that we need to remain vigilant to make sure that that's ensured for everybody.
Yeah.
So, thank you both so much.
You're welcome. Really quick, if Susie Penhollow, if you're watching, I hope you don't mind I shared your story, but
it's a great story.
She inspires me. She inspires me, and I know that voting matters to her a tremendous amount. So
right.
I'm sure I won't be in too much trouble.
So we will be posting the, sorry, Kim, go ahead.
I'm just gonna add one more thing. Dolores Huerta is a hero of mine, and she encourages people to think that you have power in your person. There is something very empowering about participating in this process and helping others do that.
Agreed. And Kimberly talked about a couple of different links. We're going to put up a slide at the end of this video presentation so you can more easily access Chalk the Vote. I think there's going to be a Chalk the Vote event down at the Historical Museum during that week. So we look forward to welcoming people down to the museum to be creative and express their support.
We got a lot of sidewalk.
Got a lot of sidewalk down there. Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Kelly, so much.
Thank you. Bye.